Well, I am doing a missionary this morning, and as you get older, some of you know you got to use these. So, William Carey. Is anybody familiar with William Carey? Okay, a couple hands. Well, I learned a lot more about William Carey as I went through this study. And he was born in August 17th, 1761 in Pollarsbury, England. And he died at the age of 72 in Serampore, India. So that's where he ended up being a missionary most of his life in India. But a couple things at the beginning. He was a British Christian missionary, a particular Baptist minister, particular with a capital P, translator, social reformer, and a cultural anthropologist. And he founded the Serampore College University in India. A few of his, as far as his early life goes, he was the oldest of 5 children. And he was born to Edmund and Elizabeth Carey. They were weavers. That was their trade. And when they were in Purry End, it's a little village in Northamptonshire in England. William was raised in the Church of England. And when he was 6, his father was appointed the parish clerk of the village schoolmaster. So as a child, he was inquisitive, and he always was interested in natural sciences, and so he picked up on botany. He just loved the growing the plants and flowers and that sort of thing. So he also possessed a natural gift for language. He taught himself Latin to begin with. At age 14, his father got him a job as an apprentice to a cordwainer. Anybody know what a cordwainer is?
A shoemaker.
A shoemaker, that's right. I had to look that up. And in the same village. And so Charles Nichols was his master, and he was a churchman like himself. And also John Warr, he was a dissenter. So through the influence of Carey, William Carey eventually left the church and joined a small congregational church where he was. And he also taught himself Greek while he was growing up as well. Well, when Nichols died in 1779, Carey went to work for another local shoemaker. His name was Thomas Old. And so Thomas Old had a sister-in-law. He married Thomas Old's sister-in-law, Dorothy. Dorothy Placard in 1781. And Dorothy was illiterate. She had a sign with a kind of a rough cross. So Carey was very educated, and he married a very uneducated lady. So it was kind of a totally opposite there as far as their education goes. They had 7 children, 5 sons, 2 daughters, and both of the girls died while they were infants, as well as they had a son, Peter, who died at the age of 5 from dysentery. So Carey took over the business after Thomas Old himself died, and during the business of the shoemaking business, Carey taught himself Hebrew, Italian, Dutch, and French. Often while he was working on shoes, he was doing that. Similar to how the kids work on their Bible verses while they're laying blocks or they're working on a summer team. He didn't leave any time pass him where he could study. So as far as the humble origins go, he would call himself a cobbler. If you're a higher status, you're a shoemaker, is how they entitled them. But Carey became involved in the local association of the particular Baptists. They had formed a group, a couple names, part of the group, John Ryland, John Sutcliffe, and Andrew Fuller. They were the 3 close friends of his, came together with the group and to to come together. They invited him to preach in some nearby villages, and Carey was baptized by Ryland and committed himself to the Baptist denomination. In 1785, Carey was appointed the schoolmaster for the village. He also served as at a local Baptist church as a pastor. Some of the people who Carey looked up to were John Eliot, William Bernard, and the Apostle Paul himself. He kind of looked at them as his heroes in life and learned from them. So as he went on ministering, he went to a ministers' conference, and Carey raised the question of whether it was the duty of all Christians to spread the gospel throughout the world. There was a man named John Collett Ryland kind of retorted after he asked this question. He said, "Young man, sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your aid and mine." And so after that, Carey became a full-time pastor. And 3 years later, he wrote this manifesto. It was called An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of Heathens. And it was a short book, and it's one of his popular writings that he had. And it consists of 5 theological justifications for missionary activity, and the scripture that remains binding on all of us Christians today is Matthew 28:18-20. Matthew 28:18-20. It says, and it's the Great Commission. Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." So that was one of the main things as far as his book goes. He continued to preach, and he had one message that was called, maybe you've heard of it, it was called the Deathless Sermon. Anybody hear of that? It was one of his pro-missionary sermons. And he used the text in Isaiah 54, verses 2 and 3. Isaiah 54, 2 and 3 says, "Enlarge the place of your tent, and let them stretch out the curtains of your habitations. Do not spare, lengthen your cords, and strengthen your stakes, for you shall expand to the right and to the left, and your descendants will inherit the nations, and make the desolate cities inhabited." And so a famous quotation, one of his, probably the most famous quotation he has, came from that. It said, "Expect great things from God, attempt great things for God." And maybe some of you have heard of that before. So he finally overcame the resistance to the missionary effort and to the particular Baptist Society for the propagation of the gospel amongst the heathens, subsequently known as the Baptist Missionary Society. And since 2000, it has been called the BMS World Missions. So Bible Missionary Society World Missions, which was founded in October 1792, which include Carey, Andrew Fuller, John Ryland, John Sutcliffe as charter members. So there was a doctor who had been to Calcutta, India, who had been in England raising support. And so Carey found this guy. He was a medical missionary. And so talking with him, they got together, and Carey ended up taking his family with Dr. John Thomas back to India. India for him was the first time, but back for John to start the missionary work there. So he took his eldest son, Carey, his eldest son, Felix, and Thomas and his wife and daughter, and they sailed to London, sailed from London on an English ship. And while they were going there, the captain of the ship, they had rules as far as, I guess, who they could take on their ship. Well, the captain received word that his command would be endangered if he continued on taking these families to India. So the captain, they stopped off at the Isle of Wight, and he left them there. The boat went on, and then there was another boat, a Danish boat. Danish captain was willing to offer them a passage to go to India. So meanwhile, Carey's wife was pregnant at the time. She had now given birth, and they all agreed to go on to India. His wife just didn't want to pack up and go. She was a peasant lady, and so she, I guess back then it was like, there wasn't a whole lot of whatever the guy said, this is what you do. And so there wasn't like, okay, let's talk about this together sort of thing. He wanted to go, so he was going kind of whether she went or not. And she decided to go along with them. But when they first got there, it was hard as far as supporting themselves. It was a little harder than what they thought it was going to be. And Thomas had a friend who owned 2 indigo factories, and they needed managers. So Carey moved to Midnapore and was up there for like 6 years as managing these indigo factories, raising support so their family could live. And while I was there, he completed the first revision of his Bengali New Testament, as well as starting the Mission Society rules as far as how the community would be formed, communal living, financial self-reliance, and the training of indigenous ministers were some of their key parts for the Mission Society. So during that time, that's when his son Peter died of dysentery. And because of all of that, his wife Dorothy started suffering a nervous breakdown. And she never recovered from that for the rest of her life. It affected her. So while he was working up there and doing all these different things, the Mission Society in England started sending more missionaries over. And the first ones, John Fountaine, he arrived. He was a school teacher. William Ward was a printer. Joshua Marshman was a school teacher. David Bronson was one of the students who came. And another fellow, William Grant, came over and died 3 weeks after his arrival. And being that the East India Company was still hostile to missionaries, they just couldn't do what they wanted to do. So they moved to a Danish colony at Serampore. And that's where Carey joined those fellows there in January 1800. So they started their ministry there. So once they were settled, they bought a large house, enough to accommodate all their families. That was part of the communal living. The printer, Ward, he set up a print shop with a press, and they started printing Bibles in Bengali. And so in 1800 there, one of the other fellows, Fontaine, he died of dysentery as well. By the end of the year, they had their first convert, a Hindu named Krishna Pal. And that was neat for them to be able to see that they were starting to kind of like break some walls down. And they've also, during that time, they earned the goodwill of the local Danish government and the Governor General of India, Richard Wellesley. So in 1801, a year later, Bunsen and Thomas, they both passed away. The governor there, he invited Carey to be a professor of Bengali. And being that there was a lot of Hindus there, they called them pundits. A pundit is a teacher of any field of knowledge in Hinduism. So the pundits who were there, they could look at his, make sure what he was writing was proper as far as the translation goes into the Bible. They began a translation into Sanskrit as another language. And something else that, since he had that influence with the Governor General, they had practices over there called infant sacrifice and Suti. And I just want to, a little bit about the Hindus' belief on infant sacrifice. William Carey and a fellow missionary, John Thomas, were riding near Malda, India, when they saw a basket hung in a tree in which an infant had been exposed. The skull remained, the rest having been devoured by ants. This holy act of infanticide, had been committed with religious fervor by a Hindu mother. So the Hindu, they had these different beliefs on sacrificing their children. In 1802, one of Carey's colleagues, they studied infanticide. Am I saying that right? Infanticide, thank you. Didn't sound right. On the river island, many women made vows to the holy Ganges River that if blessed with 2 children, one would be presented to the river. As many as 100 children, he estimated, though probably more, were being sacrificed every year. There was a report that Carey Jr. reported one such sacrifice to his father. A boatman pulled a drowning child into his boat, and he presented the infant back to its mother. Well, the mother took the child, broke its neck, and threw it back into the river again. So that's how strong of beliefs that they had on doing this. So Carey had an influence with the governor to get rid of these sort of Hindu practices. And it took a while, but by 1829, a lot of these practices, were no longer accepted. His wife, Dorothy, gave birth to another son, Jim Carey, and she later died in 1807 due to her mental breakdown. And that really wore a lot on him. There was some of his fellow missionaries suggested that he put her in the sane asylum because she was just really off the wall. But he did not want to, his thought of how she would be treated in one of these places, he couldn't think of how that would be. So he kept her at his house in a room and with his kids, which was very rough for the children, hearing her outbursts of rage and that sort of thing. So it was hard on them as a family during that time. He married another lady after that. He remarried his new wife, Charlotte Rumer. She was a Danish member, and she was very intellectual. She was like his equal as far as education goes. So they were married for 13 years, and then she passed away. So during that time, the printing press mission, translations continued to come in. They had a fire, unfortunately, in March of 1812. It caused about $10,000 euros in damages, lost work, irreplaceable manuscripts, but they continued on, and in Carey's lifetime, said the mission printed and distributed the Bible in whole or part in 44 languages and dialects. That's a lot of different languages that people were able to read the Word of God in different dialects. And what I read, at least 6 or 7 languages he studied and knew himself, which was a blessing to be able to do that. Excuse me. So there was another young man, Mr. Judson. He was an American congressional missionary. He was en route to India. He was studying the scriptures in preparation to meet with Carey. And through his studies, he became a Baptist as well. And Carey's urging of American Baptists to take over support for Judson's mission. And so the foundation in 1814 of the first American Baptist Mission Board and the General Missionary Convention of the Baptist denomination in the United States of America for foreign missions. So later commonly known as the Triennial Convention. And most American Baptist denominations today are directly or indirectly descended from this convention right there. Carey's second wife died in 1821. Then his eldest son, Felix, passed away, and he married a third time to a widow named Grace Hughes. He was able to baptize all three of his wives after they were married. But during this time, as years went on, new missionaries were coming over. And so there was a little bit of resentment between the old missionaries and the new missionaries. Some of the new ones didn't want to live in the communal housing like that had been set up over the past years. So there was a time where Carey formally severed ties with the mission society that he founded, and he moved on to the college grounds, where he ended up living a quiet life until he died in 1834, revising his Bengali Bible, preaching and teaching students. And so he had a very busy life, and a lot of physical trauma, family-wise, deaths, and whatnot. A couple of the things here, while he was over there in India, Carey started Sunday schools in which children learned to read using the Bible as their textbook. There was a point to where only there was a certain people group that were able to be educated. So if you were like lower, you didn't get much education. So he wanted to change that. And even for women, in 1794, he opened up a school at his own cost, first primary school in all of India. The public school system he initiated expanded it to include girls in an era when the education of female was considered unthinkable. So he brought that into the working there. And so Carey's work is considered to have provided the starting point of what blossomed into the Christian Vernacular Education Society, providing English medium education across India. There are schools, there's like 9 schools named after him in all different countries. There's a couple here in the United States and spread out all around. He is referred to as the father of modern missions and as India's first cultural anthropologist. So he was dedicated so much to what God has called him and to preaching the gospel. And so there's some neat things that we can learn from him and take. And so, and the Great Commission, that's for all of us to continue to do our best. What has God called each one of us to do? And as long as we're obedient to him, that's all that he asks us to do, is be obedient for what he has called us to do. So thank you very much.